Welcome to the Investopoly podcast. Our goal is to share easy to understand, evidence based, holistic insights to help you master the game of building wealth. My name's Campbell. I'll be filling in for Stuart today. What I'd like to do today is something I've been looking forward to is I'm just going to address purely listener questions in this episode. There's no main topic. And this is something I've been looking forward to doing because in previous episodes, there's usually been a couple of questions answered at the end of the episode, and it felt as though they've been a little bit rushed. And there's always so much to discuss and sort of unpack in a lot of these questions that I've been looking forward to the opportunity to address them all in a little bit more detail, and I'll see how many I get through, but I'll sort of talk to a few of the points and elaborate on some of these listener questions. So I guess if I'm answering your question today, I hope you benefit from a little bit more of an in-depth answer. So let's get into it. The first question is from Sarah. Sarah writes, "My dream home was passed in at auction but was sold later that day. I was wondering if I could contact the new buyer through the agent and offer to buy the property from them at a bigger price, a substantially bigger price. It's been 7 days since the auction." So I'm not quite sure exactly when Sarah sent this in, but I think it's been well past 7 days now because it takes us a little while to get to these questions. But interesting one, Sarah. So I guess the property might even be settled by now and the people have probably moved into the home. I'm sorry that you missed out on it. Look, could you contact the agent to get through to the buyer? You could. Look, before I get into that, probably what I'll say is, I don't know how you mentioned a substantially bigger price. I'd always be reluctant to pay over market value. I get sometimes if it's your dream home, then fair enough. Sometimes you can spend on things more than what it's really worth. It's more of a lifestyle, personal asset. So, fair enough. But I'd be, wary about significantly overpaying for the property. So I think you just need to be careful there. But in any case, could you contact the agent? Yeah, you could. Yep, you could do that. Alternatively, you could contact the buyer directly. So, bypassing the agent, because if the agent's involved, then there's going to be, they're going to want to be involved in managing the transaction. They'll claim, the buy, and, you have to probably get the agent involved in terms of their fees through that process. But, there's a growing movement. I've seen quite a few examples of people selling or buying properties not using a real estate agent. So there's a couple of different instances where this occurs. So a client of mine, he had an investment property. Yeah, well, I won't say the suburb. Yeah, he had an investment property that he needed to sell because we deemed it as probably the least quality of his properties, but he also needed to sell the property because he wanted to buy a beach house. So really we needed to liquidate that, and he had a tenant in there, which through his discussions with the tenant was interested in buying the property because they're in a financial position where they could do so. So they basically reached an agreement, and you've got to be careful in doing this, and that you've got to get a really clear idea of valuation to make sure that you're not selling the property for less than what it's worth, or if you're buying it for more than what it's worth. So paying a couple of $1,000s to get a independent external valuer to come in and put a price on it makes it quite fair for both parties. But also in this example with my client, it was a really pretty consistent and replicable property. So there'd been some property sales of very, very similar properties in this particular unit block. So it was pretty easy within a tight price range to determine what the price of it would be. So he had a pretty clear understanding of it. And look, the benefits of doing it, the big benefit of doing it without a real estate agent going directly between buyer and seller is not paying real estate agent fees. They can be sort of, call it 2.5%. Depending on the property value, that can be, 30 to 50 grand sort of thing. So that's a big saving there. There's also the saving on marketing costs, if you're selling a property and those sorts of things. And really the only cost then comes down to if you're getting a valuer, maybe you're getting a building and pest inspection, which is, value is a couple of grand, building and pest might be 500 to a grand. And then the legal and conveyancing fees to actually transfer the title, which will be, a few $1,000s. So, comparatively, if you went through a sale campaign, which, real estate agents, want you to do, and then you'd have to pay marketing, there's often styling, there's often touch-up improvements to the property. That can be tens of thousands of dollars, aside from just the agent's fees. So there's a lot that can be saved in doing, a direct property transaction. So I'd almost wonder, Sarah, could you, if you really wanted to, I don't know whether the current owners, the people that bought the property, would want to get rid of it because they might love it as much as you seem to. But, there's some people that just drop a letter in the letterbox. This is becoming more common. I've heard in good blue chip suburbs of Melbourne, I know people that have received letters in the letterbox to say, "Hey, I'm interested in buying your house. Would you be interested in selling it? Contact me if you are." And there's some savvy investors that are doing that, just to bypass competition and to bypass real estate agent costs. And it's a lot more flexible, that transaction. And you're not competing with other buyers in the process. So look, Sarah, I'd almost think if you wanted to, and if you thought, you're not going to way overpay for it, I wonder whether you don't go through the agent, drop a letter in the letterbox. So that's something to consider. See how it goes. You might get no response. You might get a not interested. We don't want to move out. But yeah, it's something to consider. One other thing I'll just mention, going on a bit of a tangent with this, is I have an example where someone I know personally, they are a young couple with young kids. They live in a particular suburb in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, and they love this suburb that they live in, but their house is getting too small for them, so they want to upsize. So they're a typical young couple that want to upsize, and they've been looking in this particular suburb, and just not a lot of properties come up that are suitable for them. And through friends of friends, various connections, they have met an older couple, a retiree couple that are at the other end that want to downsize. And they're in that same suburb. They also love that suburb and they don't want to leave. And they also appreciate that not many good properties come up in that suburb. So these two people have been connected and they are looking to, it hasn't happened yet, but go down the route of just doing a sale transaction between them, not through use of any real estate agents. And, their approach in what they're doing it in order to determine fair market value is they've gone and looked at each other's properties. The retiree couple thought, yep, your place looks like a great downsizer home for us when it doesn't have all the bedrooms and the garden and that sort of thing. Conversely, the younger couple think that the property's great for them. It's going to have enough space for their growing family. And so what they're going to do is basically seek 2 to 3 independent valuations on both properties and then draw an average across those valuations. And that seems like a fair and reasonable and even and equitable approach in that, take an average between those independent valuations on both properties and then transact off that matter. Now, obviously, the younger couple, they're upsizing, so there's going to be a difference there that they'll have to pay to put forward, but, that's pretty obvious. But look, I think if that comes through, what they'd save a lot of money. Both parties would save a lot of money in agents' fees, marketing, all the various things I discussed before. So, yeah, it's interesting, Sarah. I think there's quite a bit more of this happening, those sort of private individual sales, not through a real estate agent. So, yeah, I just thought I'd make mention of that. But I hope that helps, Sarah. Best of luck. The next question is from an anonymous listener. They say, thank you for the wonderful podcast. I'm 46 and my husband's 45 and we have a 10-year-old son. Our incomes are around 200,000 each with some fluctuations depending on how much we work. We can both salary package as work is in the NGO and healthcare sector. We have around $500,000 in super each until Trump crashed everything. Yeah, okay. And an ETF portfolio of around 480,000. I contribute extra to my super to reach the cap, and my husband gets 17% super contribution at his work. We own a free title house in a good location worth $2 million, and we have a mortgage of $860. We bought in 2020 for 1.27, so seen some good growth there. We have no other debt. We have had an investment property in the past and sold the last one during COVID for a good profit, and we used the cash to do some renovations to our townhouse, put some money into shares. Currently, we save about 20% of our income, so that's around $4,000 to $5,000 a month. We love to travel and have relatives overseas, so a lot of our money goes there, and we need to replace our cars. Currently no debt, but around 10 years old, and we'd like to purchase an electric vehicle. We still need about 50,000 left to do the renovations and have about 50,000 in savings in the offset. I'm interested in your thoughts about where to next. I'm in medicine and have been thinking about trust structures for asset protection and how to best plan for retirement. We'd like to travel more with possibly some longer breaks. We have a lot of equity in the house, but are unsure how to use it and didn't love being landlords, didn't like being investment property owners. We haven't engaged a financial advisor at this stage. So interesting situation here in that whenever I start by looking at someone's situation, anonymous listener, I kind of think, to your question, where to next? And at a very high level, picture, I think, what are your options? Well, you've got good surplus cash flow there. So about $4,000 to $5,000 of surplus cash flow savings per month. And that's really good. That's strong. And, you've got good combined income of 400,000. So you'd have borrowing capacity, sure, with the debt of only 860 against the home. So you'd have some good borrowing capacity there. And with your cash flow, straight away, I think you would have the ability to buy an investment property. So your options really are, do you buy an investment property? That'll take up some of your cash flow. Do you continue investing in shares, continue investing in super, put more into super via non-concessional contributions? I think at a high level, these are your options. Buy an investment property, or you could go also pay down debt more aggressively, the mortgage. So you could focus your cash flow towards that. So it's pay down mortgage, buy an investment property, invest in shares, invest more in super, or a blend and mixture of any of these options. And so I've taken the time to run some numbers for you here. Based off the balance of your mortgage and when you bought the property, and assuming you haven't refinanced since, and assuming that you're on principal and interest repayments on your mortgage, which I think you would be, and I don't know your interest rate on your mortgage, but I've taken an assumption here. Look, I'd estimate that your mortgage repayments on principal and interest are about 60,000 per annum, and I've worked backwards to work out what your general living expenses are. So, based off what you've mentioned, your surplus cash flow is about $4,000 to $5,000 per month. You can kind of work backwards from there, or we can, to work out general living expenses, because this kind of factors in whenever we're looking at, for clients, we look at what are general living expenses, what do you need to live off, what are you spending on general living. And general living expenses excludes mortgage, financial loan repayments. It's really just what you need to live off on an after-tax basis. So I guess that's a good one for just as a side note for some people. Whereas in the work that we do, we're always trying to work out what are your general living expenses. And few people really know for sure what their general living expenses are. Some people are great and they track them on, like a PocketSmith app that tracks your expenditure and that sort of thing. But most people, when we ask the question, what do you think your general living expenses are? How much do you need to live off? Most people don't know the answer. But most people are pretty good at knowing what they save. I think people track that number a little bit better because they know what they've invested in super or in a share portfolio, or they know what they've put towards property, or they can see what their offset account balance has increased over the last 12 months. So pretty much you can work backwards by just looking at, what are your incomes? What's the tax that you pay off that income? And then based off you're saving X amount, then everything else should be going to general living expenses, putting aside the mortgage as well. So working backwards from there, I think your general living expenses are about 160,000 per annum, roughly. So you can use that information as you like. So by my calculations, if you continue maximizing your concessional contributions to super, which you're pretty much doing already, or you are really with the salary sacrificing and with your husband's higher super guarantee rate that his employer pays, you are maximizing your concessional contributions of 30,000 per annum. So if you continue doing that, and then with all your surplus cash flow, if you were to channel that towards the mortgage, I think you'd pay off the mortgage in about 8 to 9 years. And by my calculations, if you continue with the current contributions to super that you're doing, and with an assumed 7% growth rate of your super funds per annum, I estimate that you'll both have about 2.4 mil in super each by age 60. So that's really healthy. That's a very good position. And there's been a lot of discussion lately about the 3 mil super cap. So, 2.4 each is a very healthy super fund. And it's pretty amazing, that number, but that's over, the next sort of 15 years with large contributions going in every year, and then just compounding interest of that super fund in a low tax environment. So it's quite surprising, but that's what I think. It gets to about roughly sort of 2.4 each in super. That's really good. I mean, is that going to support general living expenses of 160,000 easily, no problem. And I think then it sort of leans towards, well, I wouldn't be putting any more in then. I think if you super balance naturally gets to that kind of level, just with concessional contributions being maxed over, 15, 20, 30 years time, whatever it is, if it gets to sort of that 2.4, that's a really reasonable number. And I mean, even if we've got an index, of course, for inflation, the general living expenses, they're going to go up. But in any case, 160,000 in today's dollars indexed into when you're 60, that's a very healthy super fund for both of you to live off in retirement. So let's explore the buying an investment property option. So if you were to do it, I mean, you don't have much of a cash reserve at the moment, but you wouldn't want to use any of the cash to put towards it. We speak a lot about putting in as little cash as possible towards an investment property, so you have really good equity in your home. So you use that equity for the deposit and costs towards the investment property. So you would borrow full costs if you were to do it for an investment property. So let's say you bought a property for 1.5 mil. I think you would have the borrowing capacity to do that. I haven't checked that exactly, but roughly speaking, I think you would. And you have the equity in your property to fund the deposit loan for the full cost. So if you bought a property for 1.5 mil, and I've assumed rental yield of 2.5% that gets shaved by about 30% for property expenses, and you're borrowing the full cost, and then based off interest rates for a investment interest only loan today, I think the holding cost pre-tax would be about $70,000 to $80,000. I mean, that's pre-tax. Obviously, there's negative gearing benefits. So then what would it reduce your after-tax surplus cash flow from? So if you're saving sort of that 4 to 5 grand per month at the moment, that's about 60,000 per year. So then on an after-tax basis, it would reduce that surplus cash flow to about 10 to 15,000. Because you're both in the top tax bracket, it's pretty much that holding cost gets shaved in half. And that's a good way of thinking about it. Stuart mentioned in a podcast recently, it's a good way of explaining it. I mean, I have had a client a couple of times ask me to explain negative gearing benefits in another way, like what is it really? And I think a good way to think about it is that depending on the tax bracket that you're in, it just reduces your holding costs of properties. So if you're in the top tax bracket, it's pretty close to 50%, it's 47%, but just work off half for round numbers. The $80,000 holding cost, if you're both in the top tax bracket, it turns it into about $40,000 on an after-tax basis. That's really another good way to think about negative gearing, I think, is that it reduces the holding cost. And then you can then apply that if you're actually in the 37% tax rate or the 32% tax rate, you can apply that same rationale accordingly. So then if you bought this property, this hypothetical property, and it reduced your surplus cash flow to about 10 grand per annum, if you then channeled all of that surplus cash flow to the home loan, it'd probably push out paying off the home loan to about 13 years, from 8 or 9 years to about 13 years, still before assumed retirement age of 60, so that's not a problem. I guess maybe where the problem comes into this is after the mortgage is paid off, if you then started channeling your surplus cash flow towards paying down the investment property debt or offsetting it in any case, the question we always try to look at is the property going to get itself to at least cash flow neutral by retirement? Because you don't really want to, I think that's the aim. I often don't need to have an investment property debt paid off completely, but just get the property portfolio to cash flow neutral. Then it washes its own face in retirement. Because once you retire and you don't have your employment income, negative gearing benefits are really null and void. So I think that's kind of the aim. And the question then is, well, would this property, this hypothetical property, get to roughly cash flow neutral by the time you retire at 60? And I've assumed the rent will increase by about 4% per annum. Now that's fair for the last 10, 15 years. And I think I'll use that as the assumption, but maybe that's being a bit generous. Maybe it's 3% per annum rental increase, but I've included 4%. So naturally, the cash flow of the property should increase as the rent goes up. However, you do start incurring other costs like land tax, which are quite insidious and get higher and higher. But anyways, with that factored in, the property still does get better from a cash flow perspective, and the holding cost gets lower. And then in the last few years after you pay off the mortgage, if you parked a lot of money in the offset account, so you end up parking about 600,000 against the total loan of 1.6, call it 1.6 mil. And the reason that's 1.6 mil, not 1.5, is because I've added on stamp duty and acquisition cost to that amount. So you're borrowing the full cost. So it gets the property then, once you retire, assumably at 60, down to about a holding cost of 20,000 odd. Now, that's not ideal. We'd like it to be sort of cash flow neutral at a minimum. Look, by that point in time, home's paid off, home's worth a lot more. The investment property, if it's done a 7% capital growth rate, is what I've assumed, it's worth about 4 mil at that point in time. So the debt is, there's a lot of equity in the property, but you'd ideally like to hold it even longer. The other thing to consider, though, is that with the dividend income, so as long as I think if the negative gearing from the investment property in retirement is then getting absolved or consumed by other income, other passive income, investment income, then that's okay. And so if I look at that share portfolio that you had, I haven't factored in contributing anything else to it, but with a 7% capital growth rate by the age of 60, that gets to about a mil. And then the income, I've assumed about a 2.5% income and 4.5% capital growth from that share portfolio. So the income provides about 25,000 of dividend income into your name. So the 25,000 kind of offsets the negative cash flow of the investment property of 20,000. So it kind of nets out not too bad. And then in terms of what you need to live off then, well, you've got super kicking in at that point in time, which you've got plenty of, as I've discussed before. So what's my conclusion? I think that, an investment property could be a fairly good option, because I think your super's going to take care of itself anyway. The mortgage is going to take care of itself anyway. The property, you should be able to pay a little bit offset a little bit of the investment property loan and get that property to sort of close to cash flow neutral, maybe 20 grand holding cost perhaps, but then you'll have 20 grand income from the share portfolio in your personal name, which will offset that. So then you'll be left with just funding retirement from super, no mortgage, which was paid off a while ago, and then you're holding an investment property longer term and you're not going to be forced into selling it. So I think that's what I'd probably consider, anonymous listener. However, it comes down to your personal preference. In reading your question again here, you've mentioned that you didn't really love being landlords, and you sold the property because it's the other investment property because it's a hassle. So that's not the only answer. Of course, you could not do the property and you could continue to build up your share portfolio. I actually don't think I'd be doing super yet by doing investing in super because of where I think your super balances will get to mathematically. So I'd probably be doing a little bit more investing personally. I wonder then whether whenever you start to have a significant share portfolio, which it would turn to if you started contributing more to it, I wonder whether, a family trust might be appropriate for you. It's got to warrant the benefits. In the initial years, I note you've got a son that's 10 years old. So whilst you're both in the top tax bracket, your incomes are very similar. There's really not much benefit in the family trust. But thinking longer term, once your 10-year-old turns 18, and if he is still living at home for a number of years and has a low income, you can distribute income from the family trust to him. So there might be, whilst he's at university, perhaps there's going to be a number of years there that you can distribute income to him. And there's also potentially the option that if there's a lot of income being generated from a share portfolio in the family trust before you can distribute to your son, you could also have a corporate beneficiary to tax the cap rate at 30%, and you could distribute money to that as well. So that's something to consider. I think if you went down that route, I feel like if you're starting with a balance of 500,000 and contributing quite a bit to it every year, if you went down the share investing route, my feel is that a family trust would have merit and would have benefit. But look, that's something we'd have to look into. Okay, the next question is from Tarkin. Tarkin, that's not his real name, but he's said that he'd like to remain confidential, so we'll refer to him as Tarkin. No problems. He has written, outside of the below, are we too poor for you to advise us formally? Anyways, my wife and I have one dependent child who will most likely be at home for another 8 years. I earn around 90,000 a year with a 15% government super contribution. I'm age 45. I contribute $50 per fortnight extra to super, and my balance is around 390,000. My wife earns part-time around 45,000 a year as a casual teacher. She's 47 with the same super guarantee. We are mortgage free and our home is worth about 1.1 mil on a 600 square metre block. We own a rental property which we rent out to defence housing, and the mortgage on that is about 430,000 with equity of 350,000, and we have about $5,000 in offset. We built both of these homes to save on stamp duty in Adelaide. My wife has a share portfolio of around 400,000 with dividends of around 20,000 a year. She doesn't reinvest the dividends, she takes them. We have a joint share portfolio of around 120,000 with an advisor. Most recent picks have been losers, but the advisor works for an advisor recently listed in the top 100 advisors. We're up 33%, excluding what we've taken out as dividends to reinvest in new purchases over about 10 years, i.e. the balance of 120,000 tells us we're up about 33%. Not sure whether to break the advisor relationship. Moving on, we currently have about 20 grand a year from family. I invest 10 grand in a joint share portfolio, and my wife uses her 10,000 for living expenses. Got no HEX debt. At tax time, my wife's salary and dividends, she was getting tax bills. Her super is around 250,000. Therefore, she contributes about 80% of her employment salary pre-tax to super. And we set aside her dividends to fund fortnightly living expenses plus the 20% of her salary. So I don't like our house. It's going to be too big. We built it when we were young, so we're compromised on fixtures, e.g. low ceilings, too many windows, one level home. It's starting to look tired. We want to retire at 60 and I want to live in a better quality home. My job is stressful. What should we do from here? E.g., should we buy another block of land to build a home to rent out initially, then move in, cease my wife's super contribution strategy, do something else, invest more in shares, borrow to invest in shares, dump the advisor, use a buyer's agent, etc.? Help. Okay. So, Tarkan, let me just start by answering the first question. It's not a fact of being too poor for you to advise us formally, but really for us to take on a client and to advise them formally, there needs to be enough scope of work for us to add value to your situation above and beyond what you'd have to pay us in fees. And look, I think you're probably right in what you're assuming. I think there's probably not that level of scope of work for us to add value to your situation. That's more of what it's a case of in answering that question. Look, in terms of what I think you should do, let's talk about the share portfolio with the advisor. So I don't know how much you're paying this financial advisor to manage a share portfolio of 120,000, but yeah, I mean, it's not a large amount that they're managing. And kind of reading between the lines here, that's pretty much all they're doing. It sounds as though they're not giving you any holistic strategic advice around your personal situation, around, these questions that you've written to us around your home and what to do with it and super contributions, all that sort of thing. It sounds as though what you're saying is that the advisor is just managing the $120,000 portfolio. Now, unless they're only charging a minuscule fee, I think that's probably unlikely given the compliance, requirements of advisors these days. So, if you're paying them sort of thousands of dollars, $3, $4, $5, $6,000 sort of thing, at least to manage that portfolio, and that's all you're getting for them is the managing of that portfolio, then I would probably end that relationship. I think if you're getting really good value and more strategic advice outside of that portfolio, okay, fair enough. But if it's just the portfolio itself, I mean, there's some pretty simple things you can do to construct a portfolio, I would think, and that's not worth paying it based off that level of funds. If it was 1.2 million or $2.2 million, and all you were getting was their portfolio management, maybe that would be fair enough. But if it's just that, I don't think so. In terms of the performance of the fund, so 33% growth over the last 10 years. So that's about 3% capital growth per annum. So I'm guessing you're working out that you invested initially $90,000 and it's now $120,000. That's the 33% growth, and that's roughly 3% compounding capital growth per annum. That's how that's worked out. So that doesn't sound great, but it could be the case that it's high yielding, it's high dividend paying because you've spoken about these dividends that it produces. But look, if we just benchmark that performance, I mean, the ASX 200 has returned 8% over the last 10 years. And so 4% of that is capital growth. And then the other 4%, roughly, rough numbers here, is dividend income. So, I mean, I think you should have been reinvesting the income, to be honest. I think you really that's the way you get the portfolio compounding. And I think you should have been taking the income, not salary sacrificing. You should have been taking the wife's income personally. But even still, I'd say the portfolio is pretty underperforming. And to have it in something that's producing 3% capital growth and much more income, I don't think is the right thing you should be doing in accumulation stage. So for example, my wife and I's share portfolio, I want it to be really focused on growth. I want to have really as much as possible of that portfolio return, the percentage of it from growth. Because income you pay tax on every year. And whilst I'm working, I'm paying a lot more tax than, whereas if it's capital growth, you don't have to pay tax on that every year and you can choose when to realize it. And when you do realize it, you get a 50% CGT discount. So, and I'm more focused on accumulation and compounding growth, really. So I think that's where you should be more focused on that portfolio, is really targeting it to growth. Now, of course, our share portfolios that we manage for clients and my personal one, of course, has some level of income return from it. I wouldn't want to reduce it all to capital growth, and it'd be hard to do that anyway. But I think through the construction of the portfolio, I've tried to angle it a little bit more towards capital growth than income. So that's just something to consider. The next thing to address, Tarkin, is your wife's salary sacrificing. So she's salary sacrificing a lot here. You've mentioned her part-time income's $45,000 per year, and she's salary sacrificing 80% of that. So really, the income that's distributing to herself personally for her employment income is about $9,000. That's too much. I think when you're in the lower tax brackets, I don't think that's going to be netting you the ideal benefit, really. So if you think about the tax brackets, right, so up to $18,200 is the tax-free threshold. So you pay nil tax on that. And then from $18,200 to $45,000, you pay 16% tax rate. And it's with sort of 18% really with the Medicare levy. I mean, that's coming down with the government's recent tax cuts in the coming years. It's going to come down to 15% and then down to 14%. But really, if you consider the fact that with salary sacrificing, that's concessional contributions into super. Going into super, there's a contributions tax of 15%. So I think that you are salary sacrificing too much. Salary sacrificing when you're in a much higher tax bracket is great. Say you're in, the 45% tax bracket. If you salary sacrifice and pay 15% contributions tax, well, you're netting 30% tax saving. But when you're in the lower tax bracket, you're not really netting much at all, particularly if you're netting it down into the tax-free threshold. Then you wouldn't have paid any tax on the income in the tax-free threshold, but you're paying 15% contributions tax. So you get my point there. I don't think that that's the ideal arrangement there. Look, I note that she has about $20,000 of dividend income from the shares, but it's really not netting too much of a benefit, I don't think, in doing a heavy salary sacrificing of that nature. So I'd let the money flow through to you personally. And I mean, you'd potentially even be better doing it as non-concessional with after tax. I think for a portion there, you'd pay less tax by doing it that way. I think you should just be letting her income flow through to you. I'd probably, remove the salary sacrificing. I don't think focusing that heavily on super for not much of a tax benefit is the way to go. But more, I think you shouldn't be doing that because what you've discussed about your home. So, you've mentioned that you're tired of your home, you don't like it, you want to live in a better quality home. And you've considered, should we buy another block of land to build another home to rent out initially? I don't think you should do, no, I don't think so. I honestly think if you want to upgrade your home, you should just do a simple upgrade of the home. Sell the house for, what did you mention? It's worth 1.1 mil. Buy something with an established home on it. It doesn't have to be a new home, but something that's, at least livable. Go through the normal process of a good property investment around, land value, land component, and good location, all those sorts of things. But I think that if you think that you want to upgrade your home, you should do that as soon as possible. I think that's the important thing that you need to sort out. The longer you leave it, because you're probably going to have to take on a bit of mortgage, I'm guessing, if you're going to, buy something for more than 1.1 mil, you're going to have to go and borrow a little bit. It's better to do that now, get a bit of debt against it. So I think you need to do that as soon as possible to lock in the land value rather than trying to do it in 5, 10, 15 years time when you realize you really don't like the house. So if that's something that if you do want to move, I would do that as soon as possible. I think really for clients always, you should try and secure the forever home as soon as possible. It's just the best way to go. So I'd focus on doing that, and I'd let your wife's income flow through so that you can actually help with the serviceability of taking on a little bit of debt to do that. Probably wouldn't be too much debt, I'm guessing. I think it'd just be a bit of an upgrade. I think if you bought something for 1.5 mil, say, you'd have 1.1 mil from your home, and then a little bit of a mortgage to pay off over the coming years. So I'd try and do that as soon as you can, I think. And I don't really fancy the idea of buying a block of land and building the home to rent it out initially. I mean, that construction costs are so high at the moment, that just brings a whole range of risk into it. You've got a lot of equity in the home, you sell that tax free and then upgrade and just buy the new home with it. I don't think, unless you are tradesperson, Tarkin, who can, you can do the build yourself and significantly save on cost there. Maybe that might have merit, but I don't think so. If it was me, I'd just look to buy that new home as soon as you can. And then from that point onwards, I would just work out, okay, how long is it going to take to pay down this debt, pay down the mortgage before retirement at 60. And then maybe then you start building up some more investments. As long as you're maximizing your concessional contributions, it makes more sense, more tax benefit for you to be doing that than building up your super. It doesn't really matter whose money the super is in. If your super balance ends up being much larger than your wife's, that's okay. It's all combined super funds at the end of the day. And you can do recontribution strategies and move funds around and spousal contribution splitting to even out the balances. But yeah, I'd be focusing more on you making concessional contributions to super. If you focus on that, I think that that's the way to go. I hope that helps, Tarkin. Okay, I think I've got time for one more question now, and this question is from JG. My last question got a laugh on your podcast, so I thought I'd try again. It obviously made Stuart laugh. I'm currently investigating SMSF options. I'm 45 years old with 20-year horizon to retirement. My wife and I have about 150 and 250,000 in industry super funds with high growth allocations. We both work in schools. The options I'm weighing up are the following. Option 1, do nothing, make concessional contributions for the next 20 years. Option 2, keep my wife's 150,000 super where it is and transfer my super into an SMSF and purchase a property and max out concessional contributions to both. Option 3, transfer all of our combined super into an SMSF, allocate 50% to a property purchase with leveraging and 50% to shares. I'm sort of paraphrasing here. Which of these options do you think would outperform the others, or do you have any others that might work in our situation? So, JG, I would go with option 1. I know that sounds boring, and I know it probably doesn't excite you very much, but I think that that is the best option. So look, you got to think about, so if you were to go down these other options of the self-managed super fund, and look, I'm not massive on buying property in self-managed super fund, particularly if it's all in on it. Like I think I have some clients with self-managed super funds and there's a property in there, but it's a small allocation in the broader self-managed super fund. And it's a property that's, the debt's under control. And, that's okay if it's a small piece of the puzzle, but people that go all in on property in the self-managed super fund, there's a range of issues that you come into. So Let me sort of explain my thinking here. So if you use half of the super fund, so your balance, which is 250,000, there's a lower LVRs in the borrowing for lending inside self-managed super funds. So firstly, the big banks have moved out of lending in the self-managed super funds, so you've got to go to second and third tier lenders, but that's okay. But generally, you need a 30% deposit to buy inside an SMSF. So if we use your balance, 250,000, that would buy you roughly a property of about 800,000 with 70% leverage. I mean, I don't know, that's not worth it to our view. That's not going to get something that's really investment grade and is really worth taking on that amount of leverage and risk. And look, if you went with the second option, if you combine both of your balances and then you put down a 30% deposit, that'd get you buying something for about 1.3 mil. Now, that's getting better in the range that I think you could get something that is really good quality and investment grade, but you'd be putting everything into that one property. And I just don't think it's worth it. So the lending rules within inside self-managed super funds aren't as good. So you need, higher deposit amount. The interest rates are higher. And I'm going to refer you, JG, to some previous episodes here that you can go and have a listen to. So I did an episode on the 31st of December last year called The Liquidity Trap. There's a big issue with property from a liquidity perspective. So once you commence pension, if all of the assets or a large portion of your assets are in property inside the self-managed super fund and you commence pension and you have to withdraw minimum pension payments legally, you run into a liquidity issue and you could be forced into selling property. So it's a big issue that I think a lot of people run into. That's an issue. I'll refer you to another episode Stuart did on the 4th of February this year, talking about are the benefits of investing in property within your super overstated. That's a good episode and blog. I'd refer you to that one to have a look. So in that episode, Stuart talks about the less or reduced negative gearing benefits by investing in property inside self-managed super fund. The negative gearing benefits are nowhere near as good in super because of the lower tax environment, the 15% tax environment. So you're paying a higher interest rate with a lower negative gearing benefit, which is a disadvantage of investing in property through self-managed super funds. Of course, Stuart goes to talk in that blog and episode about, of course, there is the CGT benefit. So once you commence pension, the CGT is effectively wiped. You don't pay any capital gains tax, so any growth that you've seen from that property is cleared at that point in time. But look, all in all, JG, I think I wouldn't be doing it based off your balance of super fund and the liquidity issues that I think you'll run into and the quality of investment that you would end up buying and the leveraging element. I wouldn't be doing the self-managed super fund, I don't think. Okay, I've run very much over time here and I've only managed to get through 4 of these questions, but it's been very enjoyable deep diving into them a little bit more. So until next time, bye for now.
Just a few things before we wrap up, if I may. Of course, you can send me questions at questions@investopoly.com.au. But for a quicker response, feel free to add a comment on the episode's video over on YouTube. We have an Investopoly YouTube channel and the link is in the show notes. I'm incredibly grateful for the 4.9 star rating on Apple with over 400 reviews. Thank you so much. If you can leave a review or rating, I'd love it because I'd love to get over 1,000 reviews. That's kind of my target. Keep checking the show notes for free downloads and I include book discounts there as well. And of course, if you're interested in working with my team and I've included a web link where you can find out a little bit more about what we do and get in touch with us. And of course, until next time, bye for now.